Of the strange research to come out of mid-1900s America, there is little with a legacy as enduring or as terrifying as the mouse utopia experiments. Taking place throughout the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, the grim fate of the subjects was published in the national magazine Scientific American, and the experiments themselves were largely taken as apocalyptic portents. In a post-war United States, the language used to describe the results, such as behavior sync, became synonymous with fears of an overpopulated world and violent, deviant behavior in cities. Today, they are preserved within fiction, such as Channel 4's conspiracy thriller Utopia and the classic animated movie The Secret of NIMH.
Wait, what is Utopia? Why does that look familiar? Did we start watching that, Amy, and then stop?
Today, they are preserved within fiction, such
I forget. Or did I start watching this? I don't remember.
as Channel 4's conspiracy thriller Utopia and the classic animated movie The Secret of NIMH.
Our world began changing.
So what were the mouse utopia experiments?
I love mice.
Shortly after World War II, a group known collectively as the Environmentalists were making a large push to prevent environmental degradation as well as overexploitation of the planet's renewable resources.
Cringe.
Among these people were a group specifically known as the Neo-Malthusians, a term referring to the 18th and 19th century English
Caring
scholar
about the
Thomas
environment,
Robert
dude.
Malthus. Malthus proposed that while the world's population may increase exponentially, food production can only increase linearly, leading to an eventual subsistence-level existence for the human race that became known as a Malthusian catastrophe. While advancements such as the
Okay, yeah, we could... Okay, let's just assume every single joke about women in the chat's obviously a joke. You don't have to read it that deep, okay? I really doubt there's many people or anyone at all in my chat who is a misogynist or a racist just by how I talk to myself. Unless they're a hate watcher. There might be hate watchers who watch me who are just very angry and hate women, but most people I feel like in my chat are decent people, so I wouldn't worry about it.
Green Revolution saw that this didn't come about, the Neo-Malthusians acknowledged his concerns about overpopulation and feared that this pattern would result in the collapse of civilization or, at best, have extreme adverse effects. These fears were given a platform in writing of the time, especially in works such as William Folk's Road to Survival in 1948 and perhaps most famously Silent Spring by Rachel Carson in 1962. Before the movement's explosion of popularity in the 50s and 60s, however, researchers had already begun work investigating the effects of population growth, and among them was a man named John B. Calhoun. Born in 1917, Calhoun took an early interest in science, specifically ornithology, publishing his first paper on birds when he was 15, but over time, his interest would change. By the time he received his PhD, his focus had turned to ethology, the study of animal behavior. When his education was concluded, he moved with his family to Towson, Maryland, to begin research at Johns Hopkins University in nearby Baltimore, but the research itself would be conducted much closer to home. In 1947, shortly after he arrived, he approached his neighbor about using some of their neglected property for an experiment. The scope would be massive, and according to Calhoun, his neighbor probably didn't expect such a scale when they agreed to let him use the forested area. Taking over 1/4 of an acre, Calhoun constructed a massive habitat, complete with food, water, ample shelter, and protection from predators, with the only limiting condition being their restriction to the 1/4 acre living space. He affectionately provided his enclosure a name: Rat City. Unfortunately, no publicly available images of Rat City exist. Calhoun was very familiar with Norway rats, having performed research on them for his doctorate, and he estimated that Rat City could sustain approximately 5,000 individuals, though if they reached this number, the population density would be tight. He began by placing 5 pregnant females in the enclosure, providing ample genetic diversity, and soon the population was increasing exponentially. But then something surprising happened. Rather than the population increasing to fill the space of the enclosure, it quickly leveled off at 150 members. He also noted some behavioral peculiarities. Despite the large size of Rat City, the residents seemed to gather around just a few places, forming social groups of 12 and limiting themselves to specific feeding locations. He would conclude the experiment after 2 years and 4 months, during which the population never grew over 200. Careful observation revealed the cause: high infant mortality. For some reason, as the experiment progressed and the population increased, the mothers were not caring for their young properly, leading to most of them dying before reaching maturity. Calhoun had his theories as to why this was, but to prove them, he would need more data.
Overpopulation of rats?
In 1954, about 5 years after his initial experiment concluded, he was hired by the National Institute of Mental Health, often shortened to NIMH. Within the laboratory of psychology, Calhoun
Secret
was
of
given
NIMH?
ample resources to continue his work. With a team, he began feverishly
what that
designing
means?
and constructing habitats, sometimes referred to as universes, where he performed numerous smaller-scale and more controlled versions of his original rat study on a domesticated strain of albino Norway rat. These rats would want for nothing. All physical needs for a healthy rat lifestyle would be provided for them, including food, water, climate control, and nesting material. Calhoun spent 8 years perfecting his enclosures and methods until finally, in February of 1962,
that's what the
an
movie
article
is
of his
called, The
writing was
Secret of
published
NIMH,
in the magazine
all
Scientific
caps.
American. The article was entitled...
Is that's so weird though? Nim meaning. Really? Oh, so this movie is about the rats in the... Oh, my mind is blown. What the fuck? I've never seen The Secret of NIMH. I've heard it's dark though.
Population Density and Social Pathology. His opening paragraph ominously reads so, quote, "In the celebrated thesis of Thomas Malthus, vice and misery impose the ultimate natural limit on the growth of populations. Students of the subject have given most of their attention to misery, that is, to predation, disease, and food supply as forces that operate to adjust the size of a population to its environment. But what of vice? Setting aside the moral burden of this word, what are the effects of the social behavior of a species on population growth, and of population density on social behavior?" Unquote. To
Another
answer this
video idea,
question, he
possibly?
cited 6 of his experiments in particular, all with similar
free on
composition
YouTube?
and concerningly similar results.
Should we watch
The design
it?
of these habitats was simple. The layout was a rectangle measuring 10 feet by 14
about
feet,
this?
divided into 4 equal sections by electric fences. 3 of these fences sported bridges
night?
over which the rats could climb, while one fence lacked such a bridge, essentially creating one long space that wrapped in on itself. Each section was equipped similarly, with a food hopper, water, and nesting areas accessible by spiral staircases. But Calhoun, leveraging his experience with the rats, made special changes to encourage specific behaviors. He enticed the rats to use one of the center pens by making the spiral staircase to that pen's living spaces shorter than the others, though he admits this was a comparatively small factor. But the more insidious change was to their food supply. In half of the experiments, Calhoun supplied powdered food, but in the other half he placed feeders of his own design, consisting of hard pellets behind a wire mesh. Half of his experiments began with 32 mice, the other half with 56, of evenly male and female composition, and all having
Why
just
no
reached maturity.
pictures?
Calhoun estimated that approximately 40 rats could comfortably be housed in these enclosures, but he would allow these populations to increase to 80 before he would cull them. Almost immediately after introduction, things began to go awry. The females, unsurprisingly, spread themselves out somewhat evenly through the pens, but after the males jockeyed for dominance and those of highest rank were determined, they began to distribute themselves strangely. Less dominant male rats will typically
'Cause it
awaken
got
earlier and begin
super
to
dark.
wander and forage for food, and due to the design of the
I'm
pen,
nervous.
this meant that they usually would end up in the center sections to eat. During this time, the dominant males of the outer pens would wake up and begin guarding their respective territories. Since there was only one entrance ramp to either end, the dominant males of either pen would bar the return
would
of the less
guard
dominant
it?
males, forcing the male population to clump in the center pens, while the dominant end males protected what came to be their harems. Only a few other deferential males were allowed to remain. These few remaining males began exhibiting odd behavior. Though they would spend most of their time in the burrows with the females, hiding away from the dominant male, they would never attempt to mate with any of them. Instead, perplexingly, they would try to
Shad
mate
rats?
with the dominant male, and even more perplexing, the dominant male would not fight these attempts. At the same time as this was happening, the effect of Calhoun's special feeders was taking hold. Since procuring food was such a lengthy process at the hard food feeders, it was common for
The
one rat to join
experiment
another while in the
reveals
process of
women
feeding.
rats
By
stare
this
at
method,
the
the rats
walls.
slowly became conditioned to eating in the company of other rats until, eventually,
that's what we
the
got
rats
from
would
this
refuse
experiment.
to eat unless another rat was present. Since more rats tended to be in the center pens, this behavior meant that, over time, more and more rats made their way there, further condensing them. This heightened the proximity of an already cramped population. In the experiments with the powdered food, this effect was far less pronounced. With these factors combined, Calhoun noted what he called a behavioral sink, or an increase in pathological activity in the rats due to the stress involved in such high population density. For the females, the behavioral sink manifested in reduced capacity for nest building and young rearing. Infant rats are extremely dependent upon their mothers for nearly all things. However, under the effects of the behavioral sink, the mothers would often be interrupted in their nest building practices to engage in some other social activity. As time wore on, this led to sparser nests which could not house the young properly. If a mother decided to move her litter, she often would only move some of them or scatter them about the pen in separate locations. What's more, when female rats are ready to mate, the males can sense it, and the enclosed space meant that a female could not escape the continuous advances of the males during these periods. Even when they would enter their nests for a reprieve, they would be followed in and harrowed. These factors together resulted in an extremely high infant mortality rate, in one case reaching 96%. For For the males,
Dear
this
God.
manifested in
I
different
keep
ways.
saying that.
The dominant males would
Come up with a
occasionally
new
lash
word.
out in violence
Wow.
against the other members of the pen, including infants, often biting and wounding their tails. Among the lower class males were 3 groups. The first he described as the homosexuals, which he immediately corrects as pansexuals, who would not compete for status but would often attempt to mate with any other rat, regardless of gender or age.
Now that's where it's at, dude.
Much like in the end pens, these advances went unchallenged. The second group he described
They're
as
living life.
somnambulists, who moved slowly through the pen without interacting with other individuals in any fashion, and the other rats, in turn, ignored them, except in rare circumstances. These rats, externally, he described as fat, sleek, and healthy-looking. But to him, the strangest group was the third, which he named the probers. These rats were hyperactive, hypersexual, and pansexual. Despite violence from the dominant males, they would viciously pursue females in heat, eschewing any sort of courtship ritual and following them into their burrows to mate. Later on in the experiments, they would often find the corpses of the improperly cared for young, which they would cannibalize. In time, one of Calhoun's assistants would publicly describe these pens as hell. At this point, Calhoun ended the experiments, but he predicted that these pathological changes would have eventually led to the deaths of the colonies. At their conclusion, he would take the 4 healthiest males and females and allow them to breed, but their behavior had been so inexorably altered that none of their pups survived beyond weaning.
Wow. That was awful.
This short article enraptured its U.S. audience,
We're
and
only
the effects on
halfway
both the
through?
scientific world and popular culture were immediate. People began to relate Calhoun's rat experiments to modern
This is your
city
idea
life,
of a positive stream? Yes. Aren't you guys feeling positive? This is positivity day. All right? After this, we'll watch funny cat or dog videos or something.
In an era where fear of social deviance was reaching an extreme high,
He
it was
makes
largely
a
seen as a
second
reflection
one?
of the current time and where society could be heading, egged on by Calhoun's provocative language and allegorical design of his test environment, made to look like a city. Population density quickly became a common topic. Psychologist Carl Rogers, in his work Some Social Issues Which Concern Me, stated that, quote, "The resemblance to human behavior is frightening. In humans, we see poor family relationships, the lack of caring, the complete alienation, the magnetic attraction of overcrowding, the lack of involvement which is so great that it permits people to watch a long, drawn-out murder without so much as calling the police. Perhaps all city dwellers are inhabitants of a behavioral sink." Unquote. Soon after, studies of dense urban environments were conducted to see if these effects translated directly to humans, but what they found was inconclusive and unsatisfying. Despite the suggestions of Calhoun's rats, humans in cities reacted differently or sometimes opposite the manner that
it was
researchers
inconclusive.
expected,
That
depending on the
means they
location.
need more
no matter how they
cannibal
tried,
rats.
no evidence of a widespread behavioral sink could be found in urban areas. But this did not dissuade Calhoun. Even as others explored the problem of overcrowding, Calhoun frantically continued his research. Now a
Of
celebrated
course he
success
did.
and emboldened by the public acceptance of his ideas, he resumed
The
his work
Pope?
at NIMH on an even larger scale, though again away from
Who
the
was
public
that?
eye. He spent his time on new subjects as he continued to perfect his
was that-
enclosures
was
and
that- that was
experiments
the
until
Pope, was
finally,
it?
after 11 years,
I don't know what
Calhoun
the Pope
revealed
looks
his magnum
like.
opus through an article he entitled Death
that the
Squared,
Pope?
which was published in the journal Proceedings of the Royal Society
Pope
of Medicine
equals
in
rat?
January of 1973. The lengthy opening to this article was undeniably apocalyptic. Calhoun wrote, "I shall largely speak of mice, but my thoughts are on man, on healing, on life and its evolution. Threatening life and evolution are the 2 deaths, death of the spirit and death of the body. Evolution, in terms of ancient wisdom, is the acquisition of access to the tree of life." Unquote. He goes on to heavily reference Revelations and of the riders of the apocalypse, using them to proclaim
Cannibal
that the
Rat
Hippocratic
sounds
oath
like
applies
a
not
name
only to
of
the body,
a
but to the
band.
spirit. After this dramatic introduction, he
band
described his test. For the most part, these new
exploitation
experiments
film?
were similar to
I
his
thought you were just gonna say a
1963
band.
trials, including unlimited access to food and water, protection from the elements and predators, and safeguards against disease. Many parts, however, were drastically altered. As Calhoun mentions in his introduction, the Norway rats used in his first publicized experiments were replaced with albino house mice, which were taken from a breeding group from the National Institutes of Health made specifically to prevent communicable disease. To fit his new subjects, Calhoun had designed an entirely new enclosure. This version was much more vertical, with 16 wall-mounted housing areas for the rats at the tops of long metal tubes, which Calhoun called walk-up apartments. At the bottom of each apartment was a virtually unlimited supply of food, water, and nesting material. With the space provided, Calhoun estimated that it could potentially hold 3,840 mice. He named this enclosure Universe 25. Calhoun's methods also had changed. Rather than instituting population controls, he would interfere far less. His plan was to place 8 mice in the enclosure, 4 male and 4 female, and simply watch and wait. Calhoun observed 4 distinct phases in the ensuing experiment. Phase A was predictable, constituting the time period before the first new mice were born, which ended up being 104 days. For the mice, these days were, quote, marked by considerable social turmoil. After the social order was established and the first brood was born, the population began Phase B, which Calhoun named the exploitation phase. During this time, the mice doubled in number every 55 days as new young grew to maturity and had their own young. This doubling continued until day 315, after which the doubling rate slowed to a rate of 145 days, nearly 3 times as long. By this point, the different broods had clumped into to one side of the pen, exhibiting the same sort of clumping as the Norway rats, but this time without any coaxing from Calhoun's designs. This change in the rate of procreation marked Phase C, which Calhoun labeled as the stagnation phase. This is when the most notable events occurred, and they eerily mirrored Calhoun's rat experiments. In a natural setting, those mice which find no social niche will leave the colony, but in this experiment, emigration was impossible, and so those forced to remain withdrew from society. These dejected males formed a large pool in the center of the enclosure. They quickly became characterized by both their inactivity and their many scars and wounds. Occasionally, they would grow agitated and attack one another, and with nowhere to retreat, the recipient of these attacks would simply lay still and endure the assault. The outcast females, rather than joining them, would retreat to the highest apartments and live quietly among one another. It was during this time that the behavioral sink manifested, with mice gathering around specific food hoppers in large numbers, while others remained almost entirely untouched, showing how, again, the need for social interaction had become so intertwined with the need for food that the former had overtaken the latter. The males who had won the initial fights also were placed under extreme stress. As more and more mice reached maturity from within and without, the leaders of the social groups continually had to patrol and defend their territory. Eventually, they reached the point of exhaustion and could not defend the females within their group. These females were therefore forced to defend the nest themselves, even when nursing their young, leading to generalized aggressive behavior. This aggression would inevitably be misdirected onto their young, who would be wounded by their mothers and forced to leave the nest before they were finished weaning. Much like the rats, the mother mice would also forget some of their young when moving from one nesting site to another. Due to the added stress of defending their territory, sometimes the mothers would reabsorb unborn mice in the womb, further reducing the fertility rates. Calhoun writes, for all practical purposes...
would reabsorb their... what?
Calhoun writes, for all practical reabsorb unborn mice in the womb to another. Due to the added stress of defending their territory, sometimes the mothers would reabsorb unborn mice in the womb, further...
That's a thing? That's possible? You can reabsorb rats? What does that mean? Is that like a miscarriage? Is that like a fancy way of saying miscarriage? But a miscarriage, it has to come out. But she absorbed it. Like, it became a does that make them stronger? Is that like a fusion technique, but with an unborn child? What the fuck? Humans do it too.
Reducing the fertility rates. Calhoun writes, for all practical purposes, there had been a death of societal organization by the end of Phase C. Finally,
they just absorb the cells, I think. Absorb the unborn. Absorb the
Phase D,
unborn.
which Calhoun entitled the death phase. This phase was characterized largely by an entire generation of young who had been rejected by their mothers early and forced to leave the nest, and they were therefore unable to exhibit normal social behavior. This manifested in numerous ways. The females of this generation had far fewer children, and those that did have children lacked the maternal instincts necessary to raise them beyond weaning. Calhoun goes on to describe the males of this generation. Quote, male counterparts to these non-reproducing females were soon dubbed the beautiful ones. They never engaged in sexual approaches toward females, and they never engaged in fighting, and so they had no wound or scar tissue. Thus, their pelage remained in excellent condition. Their behavioral repertoire became largely confined to eating, drinking, sleeping, and grooming, none of which carried any social implications beyond that represented by contiguity of bodies. Unquote. As the last mice with reproductive instincts aged beyond their fertility, Calhoun declared that the last male would die around day 1780 of the experiment, effectively rendering the colony dead as it would be unable to produce any more young. His present tense language implied that, when the article was published, the colony was still technically alive, though its final fate was practically sealed. Calhoun closed his article with a call to action. For an animal so complex as man, there is no logical reason why a comparable sequence of events should not also lead to species extinction. If opportunities for role fulfillment fall far short of the demand by those capable of filling roles and having expectancies to do so, only violence and disruption of social organization can follow. Individuals born under these circumstances will be so out of touch with reality as to be incapable even of alienation. Their most complex behaviors will become fragmented. Acquisition, creation, and utilization of ideas appropriate.
Do we live in a rat society? Are we going to become extinct the same way that rats do?
Appropriate for life in a post-industrial, cultural, conceptual, technological society will have been blocked. Just as biological generativity in the mouse involves this species' most complex behaviors, so does ideational generativity for man. Loss of these respective complex behaviors means death of the species.
Yeah, we're all dead, chat. I think we're all dead.
But even as Calhoun was performing his research on mice, others had been at work applying his theories to humans. By this point, researchers had moved to more specific locations of overcrowding rather than the generalized location of cities, testing the effects on students in dormitories and patients at hospitals, but the most fruitful example they discovered was in prisons. Paul Paulus from the University of Texas wrote that prisons were the perfect place for this sort of study, describing the social interaction between inmates as intense, prolonged, inescapable, and realistic. The prison in the study also offered the closest analog to Calhoun's rat experiments.
I'm gonna live on the moon,
not escape the company of others, even in their communal cells. There they found connections between over-socialization and suicide, violence, psychopathy, and stress. After such studies, environmental psychologists began to discover the problem. They identified two different kinds of density, physical density and social density. Physical density was the amount of space per person, while social density was the number of individuals occupying a space. They found that social density was the much more important factor, as individuals in high social density were unable to control their interactions with...
Chat, there's no air on the moon. How can we live on the moon if there's no air on it? Freaking idiots.
with others. Based on this research, human environments could be designed to at least partially mitigate these issues, allowing those living within them the privacy they needed to maintain healthy social interaction. Outside of scientific discourse,
you can't. You look. Can I grab? Look. Let me grab some. I'm grabbing some air to breathe. That's stupid. You can't do that.
Calhoun's rhetoric has maintained its strength through the years, with different groups of all political persuasion bending his results
Just
to support
hold
their
your
views
breath.
on social degradation.
Kind of got me there. Yeah, chat, you're thinking with your feelings and not with facts. Okay?
However they may define it. Among more scholarly sources, Calhoun has been both
can't
lauded
grab
and criticized for his
air,
work. Those who support him cite his forward thinking
I'm
about
grabbing
overpopulation,
air.
while those who deride him
Idiots.
cite his misrepresentation of the actual social problems within cities, guiding discourse away from the true causes of
I'm not
societal
doing it
discord.
right.
But no matter what those in the modern day think of his research, his influence on the way America views its
Is he
cities
mad?
is
No, I'm not
undeniable.
mad. Well, that was depressing. At least we learned the secret of NIMH.
Now it's time to walk away. I hope you enjoyed your stay. Did you laugh or cry or maybe subscribe? I'll thank